Hello and welcome back to the Illumination Lectures, and today we're going to look at the fate of the biblical Jesus. And this time the lecture is taken from the books King Jesus, and also a little bit from the last in this series, which is called the Grail Cipher. And in previous lectures we've seen that Jesus was a king of Edessa, a real secular king. And I think I've shown good evidence that this is true, that he was a real secular king from northern Syria, from a city called Edessa, and that he was the leader of the Jewish Revolt in AD 68 to AD 70, just as Josephus Flavius says. And this revolt ended badly for the biblical Izas-Jesus, because it resulted in his surrender to the Romans, his crucifixion, as detailed by Josephus Flavius, and his exile to Rome. But what happened after that? Well, the evidence is a little bit threadbare, but it's nevertheless compelling. As the Jewish revolt reached its climax, Commander Vespasian, because he was not yet emperor, Commander Vespasian went to Alexandria to secure the grain supplies that supplied Rome, so he would have leverage over Rome. And here is Commander Vespasian. I think this bust was taken when he was emperor, of course. And this was the year of 4 emperors. This was a year of great instability in Rome. Nero was already dead, and 3 other emperors came and went in quick succession. They were Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. And then we had Vespasian. So at this time, when Vespasian was in Alexandria, he was thinking of becoming emperor. But how could he do that? He was just a commoner. He was not related to the Caesars. He had no oracle on his side. And the emperor of Rome wasn't simply decided by the people and the armies of Rome, but also by the gods. And Vespasian had no oracle on his side. So, as Suetonius says, his supporters went out to find miraculous events that gave an oracle to Vespasian. And Suetonius says, a certain man who had lost his sight and with a crippled leg approached Vespasian while he was in Alexandria. Vespasian had been told that he could make his eyes better if he spat on them, and would heal his leg if he touched them with his heel. Vespasian could hardly believe this enterprise would work, but his friends openly urged him on, so he attempted both, and the results did not let him down. You see what's going on here. King Izas-Jesus of Edessa was the true Messiah. He was the one mentioned in the star prophecy to become the next emperor of Rome, the new king of the world. The new king would be a star from the east, and Jesus was that eastern star. He was born under the eastern star. But Vespasian had just defeated this Messiah. But Vespasian also had no oracle on his side. He was not royal. He was not a Caesar. He had no oracles. So Vespasian is now portraying himself as the new Izas-Jesus. He's imitating the miracles of Jesus. So the spitting in the eye comes from Mark 8:23, and the healing of the cripple comes from John 5:8. Vespasian was plagiarizing the Gospels and the life of King Izas-Jesus of Edessa in order to become the new Messiah, the new leader of the world. As Josephus said, Josephus Flavius, Vespasian was in the east, and therefore the star prophecy belonged to Vespasian. Vespasian was being modeled as the new Jesus. So as Suetonius continues, he says, Vespasian having entered the temple of Serapis, Basilides appeared before him and seemed to offer him the sacred leaves, the garland, and cakes according to the usage of the place. Although no one had admitted him, and he had long laboured under a muscular debility, which would hardly have allowed him to walk into the temple. Besides, it was certain that at that very time he was supposed to be far away. So who was this strange man, Basilides, who had crowned Vespasian in the temple of Serapis? Well, he was called Basilides, which means the sort of image of the king. It's from the Greek. He was therefore a monarch who was crowning Vespasian as king, a monarch who was infirm and could not possibly have been there. So who was this strange Basilides? Well, it seems quite obvious that he was actually King Izas-Jesus of Edessa. He was infirm because he still had crucifixion wounds. And he should not have been there because he was supposed to have been crucified in Judea. He was supposed to be dead. But here he was, back as if from the dead, resurrected in the temple of Serapis. Why? Why did they go to the effort of bringing him there to Alexandria? Well, King Izas-Jesus was there to confer the star prophecy upon Vespasian, to make Vespasian the new Messiah, the new Emperor of Rome, the new King of the world. And as a quid pro quo, Jesus would be allowed to live. Sent to exile, perhaps, but he was allowed to live instead of being executed. And why spare the life of King Izas-Jesus? Well, Vespasian had a good reason to, because religiously it was difficult to kill a prophet and a god. Titus, that's the son of Vespasian, had a good reason to, because he was married to Izas's best friend, Berenike. And Josephus Flavius had a good reason as well, because secularly, Jesus was a good bargaining chip with the people of Edessa. There would be no further revolts from Edessa, or he would kill the king. So, King Izas-Jesus was given a reprieve, but where should they send him to? Well, Josephus says that the leaders of the revolt were initially sent to Rome, but that's probably not the best place to send him because there were too many Nazarene Jews in Rome at the time, too many Christio Jews. So where to send him that was much, much safer? The answer is to look at a map of the Roman Empire. And here is a map. And if you want to send this King Jesus-Jesus chap as far from his power base in Judea as possible, well, if you look at the yellow line, it goes straight across the empire to Great Britain, which had only just been opened up at that time. It had only been invaded in AD 43. So if Vespasian wanted to exile a dangerous Judean rebel, Egypto-Syrio-Judean rebel, as far from their supporters as possible, the best place in the first century was Great Britain. And I think that's exactly what happened. Remember, Vespasian had conquered Britain himself in AD 43. He was the commander of Augusta's Second Legion. He was familiar with the land. He knew there was no Judaism there to give supporters to these rebels. And why do I think that Jesus-Jesus was sent to Britain? Where is the evidence for this? What was happening in Britain at this time? Well, there is some evidence, circumstantial maybe, but there is some evidence because what Vespasian did at this time is to build Fortress Diva Victrix, which is now modern Chester. Diva Victrix was a fortress, and a very curious fortress, and here is that fortress here. Because it was the largest fortress in the Roman Empire, but it was hiding behind forests and marshes. It was not on a strategic route or even on a strategic road within the new Britannia. It was out on the west coast of Britain in a very strange location, which is very perplexing for modern historians who have speculated that it might have been put there as a springboard for a sort of invasion of Ireland, but of course no invasion of Ireland ever happened. And the fortress itself is non-standard. It contained a separate accommodation block, a separate bathhouse, a separate courtyard, and a temple. And these were important features in the center of the fortress. You can see the temple here is that circular building in the center of the fortress, slightly to the left. And the addition of this temple is odd, as temples were never built in fortresses. They simply weren't necessary within a fortress. And the temple itself is odd too, because it's unique in the whole of the Roman Empire. So what was this temple doing in Fortress Diva? Well, here is the temple itself. Perhaps, do you recognize that shape? Yeah, it's a vesica-piscis. It's a shape that's supposed to be synonymous with the constellation of Pisces, but it's also an image of the circles that delineate the ecliptic and celestial spheres when you look at a zodiac, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. So let's draw those circles on the plans of this temple. These are the layout circles that were used to draw the elliptical shape. And here are those two circles. And in reality, in astrology, those two circles are the ecliptic circle and the celestial circle. That's how they look in the night sky if you look up at the heavens above. And if you draw them on a map and trace them as a temple, well, what you get is the temple of the zodiac in Fortress Diva. But this is not a standard vesica-piscis diagram, if you're familiar with what it normally looks like, because a standard vesica-piscis intersects at the half diameter. So if we're drawing a vesica-piscis, this is what we normally get. And the standard depiction is the one on the right here, where the two circles intersect at the half diameter. But what they've done in the Fortress Diva version is they've pushed those circles closer together. And so they now intersect at the 3/4 diameter point. So this is an intended design. It's not simply two circles that happen to intersect. This is a intended and purposeful design of two intersecting arcs. And the reason they've pushed the circles closer together is it gives you a wider temple. It gives you more room inside the temple. It's more functional. So it's still a vesica-piscis, but it's now more functional. And that's why they've made this design. So inside this temple, which shouldn't be there, of course, within the Fortress Diva, we have this vesica-piscis temple, which is divided into 12 chambers. So it's not simply a temple dedicated to the vesica-piscis, it's a temple dedicated to the whole zodiac. And who venerated the zodiac in this era? Well, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, if you've been listening to these lectures and talks, the zodiac was venerated by the Nazarene Galilean Jews of Judea. And that's surprising to some, but if you go to the Sea of Galilee, to the Hamat Tevera zodiac on the Sea of Galilee, as we've seen before in one of the talks, in this ancient synagogue, we have this rather marvelous zodiac. And yes, it is a Jewish zodiac. Just above this image, well, all of the signs of the zodiac are notated in Aramaic here, of course, but just above this, we also have the mosaic of the Temple of Jerusalem, the Ark of the Covenant, the shofar, all of the accoutrements of standard Judaism are in this synagogue. So a temple of the zodiac would not be linked with Rome. It wouldn't be built for Roman soldiers in a Roman fortress. But it would be linked with Nazarene Galileans from Judea. And it would have a very strong association with King Izas-Jesus of Edessa, because the Vesica Piscis also became the primary symbol of Christianity. And here it is. You're probably familiar with this particular symbol. You still see it on bumper stickers even to this day. It's the sign of Christianity, and it is also the sign of the Vesica Piscis temple, or the Temple of the Zodiac in Fortress Diva. It is the same symbology. And this same symbology, which is why people have it as bumper stickers even to this day, this same symbology is associated with Jesus himself. If you go around the cathedrals of Europe, you will often see images of Jesus in this very same Vesica Piscis shape. The same shape that was used for the Temple of the Zodiac in Fortress Diva. So who would want to build a temple of the Vesica Piscis in England in the 1st century? Well, the exiled King Izas-Jesus of Edessa most certainly would. You see how compelling this circumstantial evidence is. But the origins of this design of the Temple of the Zodiac has eluded modern historians, as many things do elude modern historians, because they measure these buildings in feet or meters. Sometimes they've converted these measurements into Roman feet, but they still missed the true origins of this particular temple, because they didn't find any whole numbers. There was nothing significant that dropped out of the calculations. So modern historians do not understand the import and origins and the heritage of this particular temple, because this temple was actually built in royal cubits, Egyptian royal cubits, what I, in my other books, have called the Thoth cubit, the royal cubit of Egypt, which was, incidentally, the cubit used by the Israelites for the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. And we know this because it says so in Ezekiel 43:13. And we know that they built the Temple of the Zodiac in Fortress Diva in royal cubits, Egyptian royal cubits, because the layout circles, those two intersecting circles, are 80 royal cubits in diameter, exactly 80 cubits. A nice round whole number, which demonstrates that this was a temple that was built in Egyptian measurement systems. So who would want to build a temple using the Egyptian royal cubit in England in the 1st century? Well, the exiled King Izas-Jesus of Edessa would, because the Israelites came from Egypt. That was the measurement system that they used. And his family came from Egypt, as these lectures have demonstrated. And it was the same cubit length that was used to design the Great Pyramid of Egypt. So now you can see the heritage and origins of this Temple of the Zodiac in Fortress Diva in modern Chester. And here is that temple today. Well, it's now a shopping centre, of course. It's the Forum Shopping Centre in Chester. And that wouldn't be so bad, but unfortunately, the Forum Shopping Centre has an underground car park. And so all of that evidence, apart from the little bit of archaeology they did before they built the shopping centre, all of that evidence has been dug up and thrown away, which is a little bit unfortunate, because there could have been so much more to be discovered. But anyway, I think I've shown that there's a substantial amount of circumstantial evidence that points towards King Izas-Jesus of Edessa being incarcerated in Fortress Diva in Chester in the 1st century. So in reality, Fortress Diva was not a fortress really. It was actually a huge 1st century Guantanamo Bay designed to hold some dangerous rebels from Syria and Judea to keep them away from their power base in the east. That's why it had a separate accommodation block, a separate bathhouse, a separate exercise area, and a separate temple for these prisoners within this prison fortress. So when King Izas-Jesus died, and I think he died in the AD 90s, the mid AD 90s, Fortress Diva had no purpose. And certainly the Temple of the Zodiac no longer had a purpose. It was a political construction. It had no purpose once Jesus was gone, so they pulled it down. Even though this was the most ornate and expensive building in Britain at the time, it was pulled down. And this, again, suits the timeline and rationale of Fortress Diva being a prison fortress, that its primary purpose was to hold prisoners from Judea. And this takes us up to the end of the 1st century. And then a very surprising thing happened on the way to the Forum. The Temple of the Zodiac was rebuilt again in the early 3rd century. But why? Why would they do such a thing? Why would you rebuild this Nazarene Galilean temple in the 3rd century? The answer is because history had just repeated itself, as it often does. Think about it. King Izas-Jesus of Edessa had been a Nazarene Galilean, a eunuch priest of the zodiac in the Elagabal stone, which we've talked about before, and we'll talk about the Elagabal stone again later, who dressed as a woman, as Josephus Flavius says. Remember, we went through the Galileans all dressed as women, just as priests do today. I mean, it's nothing unusual. You go to a cathedral and you'll see all the priests dressed as women, which is why Jesus asked his disciples to become eunuchs, as he did in Matthew 19:12. And if you didn't know that, ask yourself why you didn't know that. Why have you not been told that? Of course, if you've been listening to these lectures, you already know that. And remember that King Izas-Jesus also tried to become the Emperor of Rome during the Jewish Revolt, but failed. But in the early 3rd century, a very similar aristocrat achieved this goal. His name was Marcus Aurelius Antonius Augustus, or Elagabalus for short. And just like Jesus, he came from Syria. He was a Syrian aristocrat from the same wider family as the Edessan monarchy. He was a priest of the same Elagabal stone. He dressed as a woman, and he castrated himself, just as the disciples of Jesus were supposed to castrate themselves. And in 218 AD, Elagabalus became the Emperor of Rome, Emperor Elagabalus. And so history had indeed repeated itself. A Nazarene Galilean had now become the Emperor of Rome. However, Elagabalus was disliked and he was assassinated in 222 AD. And so once more, Rome had a prison load of rebel Syrian priests on its hand, priests who venerated the zodiac and the Elagabal stone. But what to do with them? Well, they did exactly the same as Vespasian did in the 1st century. They exiled them to Fortress Diva in Chester in Britain. And so they rebuilt the Temple of the Zodiac. And they know when they We know when this new temple was built because a coin of Elagabalus was discovered underneath the new temple. And with all of that effort, it sort of does make you wonder if Elagabalus really was killed in Rome, as they tend to say. Perhaps they just exiled him to Fortress Diva, just as they had exiled King Izas-Jesus in the 1st century. And one odd thing with this new temple is it was slightly fatter than the old one. It was the same design. It was built on the same foundations. The old temple was under there. When the archaeologists were looking at the site, they found the two temples, one on top of the other. So they knew the exact design and shape of the old temple, but they chose to ignore the old design and make the new layout circles, those two intersecting circles that form the shape of the elliptical structure. They made those new layout circles 70 cubits in diameter instead of 80. Why? It was to make the temple even fatter. It made the layout circles come closer together, as you can see in this diagram here. The top one is the old design, and the bottom one is the later design, the 3rd century design. And it made the temple slightly fatter, more functional. But it was still made in Egyptian royal cubits. One was 80 cubits in diameter for the layout circles. The other one was 70 cubits diameter for the layout circles in Egyptian royal cubits. So there is a definite link, a distinct link between these two temples, which were built nearly 2 centuries apart. Well, this new temple lasted until the end of Roman rule in Britain, which is about 405, I suppose, AD, when everything fell apart in Great Britain. None of the original Roman infrastructure was actually maintained. There was no aqueducts, no bathhouses, no grain distribution, no postal system, no administration, no sewage. The roads became impassable. There was no ferry system. There was no monetary system to actually buy anything. They went back to the old barter system. And more importantly, there was no security in the land. Roman towns, which had been bustling metropolises, undefended because there was the Pax Romana, there was the Roman peace. You didn't need a fortress in most of these new cities that had grown up after the 1st century. These Roman towns became wastelands, and 50% of the population died. It was an absolute tragedy. And because of this, there is no direct evidence that King Izas-Jesus lived in Fortress Diva. The only possible evidence we have is the Market Hall inscription, which was it was like a declaration pinned to the front of one of the major buildings in the middle of Fortress Diva. And it was a declaration from the commander of the fortress. And it may have said something about the purpose of the fortress, but we only have fragments of that inscription. And due to the shopping centre being built and all of that ground being dug up and thrown away, we no longer have any idea if there is any more of that inscription left, because we don't know where those spoils went to. The rest of the Market Hall inscription could be sitting in a spoil heap somewhere, but we don't even know where that spoil went to. I did put an advert in the local paper asking when this Forum shopping centre was built, what did they do with all of the spoils that were dug up? But nobody seems to know. Which is a shame, because if we found those spoils, we would know so much more about this site and the Temple of the Zodiac that was built upon it. So all we're left with is circumstantial evidence. But that evidence is nevertheless quite compelling. It is highly likely that King Izas-Jesus was exiled to Britain, to Fortress Diva in Chester, which is why there are such strong links between Jesus and Britain. It's why there were all these stories about Joseph of Arimathea coming to Britain, which became such a central component within Arthurian legend. Which is odd, because Arthurian legend is supposed to be out the 6th century, not the 1st century, but nevertheless we still have all of these legends associated with 1st century Judea. And the reason for these legends is because King Izas-Jesus did come to Britain. Not on a trade mission to buy tin from Cornwall. He came as a prisoner of Rome. And he was incarcerated in Fortress Diva in what is now modern Chester. Which is why William Blake wrote the famous hymn, Jerusalem. So I hope you've enjoyed this illumination lecture, and I hope you can join us again next time. And I leave you this time with William Blake's Jerusalem.